This video is going to be Secrets of the Battlefield, and also its main title is going to be the William Bliss Farm here at Gettysburg. Now, when you study the Battle of Gettysburg, and when a lot of people look at the Battle of Gettysburg and whole, there's things that stand out, certain actions that stand out, such as the 20th Maine's charge down Little Round Top, the 66 Ohio doing the same on Culp's Hill. And right here in this very field, starting over in this position, was the assault that we know as Longstreet's Assault, or the most famous action of the Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge, on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, right on up to the high water mark at the angle on the wall, which you see there. Well, what we're going to talk about in this video series is a man named William Bliss and his wife Adeline, who had moved here from New York to Gettysburg to get away from the cold winters of New York. And they bought a farm here, about 60 acres farm with an apple orchard here just south of the town of Gettysburg. And on July 2nd and July 3rd of 1863, this farm had become set up in no man's land between both Confederate and Union lines. And what happened here does not get talked about very often in the Battle of Gettysburg. This farm was burned down by Union troops of the 14th Connecticut Volunteers to protect it from being used as an enemy sharpshooter's position. Now, in the Battle of Gettysburg, there were 3 farms that were destroyed by fire totally, and that was the Peter Trossel Farm, the Emanuel Harmon Farm, and the William Bliss Farm. However, the William Bliss Farm is the only one of the 3 farms at the Battle of Gettysburg that was burned down by Union and Federal troops. In this video series, we're going to talk about the story of the 14th Connecticut's charge. The 14th Connecticut, a Union regiment, made a charge here on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, from the camera position that we're looking at in front of us. This has been the William Bliss Farm, Part 1. Now, the William Bliss Farm buildings sat between both Cemetery and Seminary Ridge. The buildings were on a flat hill, on an equal distance between the 2 ridges. There's Cemetery Ridge, and there is Seminary Ridge. And this is the area that the farm sat on a flat hill between those. A small stream, Plum Run, originated on the farm, providing ample water for William and Adeline Bliss and their 2 daughters. The bank barn was a huge wood and stone structure with an earthen bank allowing wagons to be driven directly into the 2nd story. Hay was stored in the loft while the stables occupied the ground floor. The barn was the largest substantial structure on not only the farm, but one of the largest buildings south of the town of Gettysburg. Now, on July 2nd, 1863, the abandoned Bliss Farm, which William had fled on July 1st, lay between the armies of Robert E. Lee and George Meade, and what we now call no man's land. Now, the term would not be coined for about another 50 years until one of the reunions, but as the man of the Civil War skirmish line understood that concept at once. Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps was on Cemetery Ridge. Brigadier General Alexander Hay's 3rd Division was holding the ground overlooking Bliss's farm. On Seminary Ridge, Dorsey Pender's division was placing the brigades of James Lane and Alfred Scales to hold their section of the line. These 2 brigades had seen hard fighting on the first day. Scales had been wounded, and Colonel William Lawrence was in temporary command. Lawrence reported about 500 men in the brigade were depressed, dilapidated, and almost unorganized. Lawrence was wounded, but not badly enough to be relieved of command during this very emergency. The first task to establishing a strong skirmish line, which provides protection to your main line, and Scales' brigade, the 38th North Carolina, was ordered to set up a skirmish line. opposite across the ridge, the 1st Delaware was getting the same order over on Cemetery Ridge. These orders were relatively new for soldiers on both sides. Skirmishing started with specially trained and equipped light infantry units of the Napoleonic War. These units operated between the lines, disrupting and shooting officers and any specialists that they saw. Skirmishing was like any other traditional picket line, where the job was to watch and sound the alarm. If the other side moved on a picket line, in spite of the best efforts of officers, the men usually managed to arrange a local truce, after which a brisk trade in tobacco, coffee, and newspapers would flourish. This truce now allowed men to do things that soldiers do away from their main unit and out of the officer's sight in relative safety, while having a pleasant experience and plenty of free time. The skirmish line held no such promise. It was about fighting. No truce was thought, and nothing was expected. Small groups of men slowly worked their way forward, taking advantage of any cover or concealment. Fences, trees, standing crops, buildings all become instant forts, hotly contested for, and quickly abandoned as the skirmish line moves back and forth across the fields. The object is to advance your skirmish line close to the enemy's main line and disrupt any activities by fire. It is necessary that you hit anyone, as the consistent snap of the mini ball will disrupt things. In the years of Napoleonic tactics, skirmishing had become just another day of duty that the infantry performed. The only concession most regiments tried to assign to this duty was the companies armed with rifles. Now, a place like the William Bliss Farm acts as a huge magnet line to the armies on both sides. The orchard, trees, and fences and outbuildings were prizes in the deadly contest. The grand prize was the bank barn, which you can see the original bank of right here. In Union hands, this barn is an observation post monitoring activity on Seminary Ridge and dominating the area between the lines. In Confederate hands, the barn is a fortress allowing aggressive sniping directed at activities on Cemetery Ridge. By about 9 a.m., the skirmish lines are in close contact with one another as hot fire is exchanged. The 38th North Carolina had established a line in the orchard, while the 1st Delaware has control of the barn and the farm buildings. Now, the barn's height gave the 1st Delaware the ability to direct fire directly at the Southerners. Using the other farm buildings as a base to organize the attacks, they are able to bring heavy pressure on the 38th North Carolina, requiring it to pull up further back into the orchard away from the buildings. This has been the William Bliss Farm Part 3. Now, Carrot Posey's Mississippians north of the farm lend scalesmen a hand together as they drive the Union skirmish line out of the buildings and capture the barn. The 3rd Division's front is now open as men in gray and butternut fortify this new position. The Bliss Farm has changed hands for the first, but surely not the last time over the next 2 days. The farm is starting to build a reputation as a bone of contention, while Confederate action is forcing General Hayes to charge priorities and reestablish his skirmishes. As the 1st Delaware falls back across the Emmitsburg Road, General Hayes starts to build the force that can reestablish his skirmish line. The 4th Ohio, the 111th New York, and the famed Garibaldi Guard, the 39th New York, contribute 10 companies to retake the farm. About at the same time, the decision to extend the Confederate line south on Seminary Ridge is also being implemented. Posey's Mississippians, who had helped retake the Bliss Farm, would now use it as a platform to establish a new, longer skirmish line to cover the shift south. They would assume the responsibility for the area around the Bliss Farm, just as the new Union skirmish line starts to put pressure on the barn. They managed to force the Confederates back into the orchard until about 11 a.m. At that time, Confederates advancing from the northwest through the orchard managed to push the Union skirmishers out of the barn and off the farm. General Hayes counters with the 12th New Jersey and the reorganized 1st Delaware. This attack, supported by artillery, retakes the farm and all the buildings. By 1 p.m. on July 3rd, 1863, the farm was back in Union hands, and the Confederate skirmish line was back up into the orchard. After 4 hours, things were pretty much the same as they were at the beginning. To get the idea of this small action, the Garibaldi Guard reports 28 men killed and wounded in the 2 hours of skirmishing that they were involved in. This has been the William Bliss Farm Part 3 on Gettysburg William Bliss Farm Part 4 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. The Confederate command has seemed to lose interest at this point in the aggressive operations about this time. Scales' brigade is pulled off the line and sent to rejoin Pender's division. Artillery is placed to support an attack on this farm, but none is forthcoming. A midday fool settles over the field as each side closely watches the other, but neither initiates any operations. Taking advantage of the law, General Hayes reduces the number of troops on his skirmish line from an active operation to a normal level. With the two skirmish lines a long rifle way apart, the men remained under cover, content to initiate no real action. At 3 o'clock, General Posey retrieves an order to drive the Union skirmish line in and be ready to follow Wright's brigade in a general attack. The 19th and 48th Mississippi were assigned the task of driving in the Union skirmish line, and about 4 o'clock p.m. they moved forward. Colonel Nat Harris saw the advance of the 19th Mississippi was uncovering its right flank and halted until the 48th Mississippi could join him in the attack. Taking advantage of the midday lull, the Union skirmishers had moved further west into the Bliss Farm orchard and were not easily driven. Posey was forced to add the 16th Mississippi and support the attack with artillery. The 16th Mississippi was unable to push through the orchard and retake the farm buildings. General Winfield Scott Hancock is recorded as having choice and forcible words with Lieutenant Colonel E.P. Harris over the 1st Delaware being driven from the farm and his shameful conduct in this affair. The Union skirmish line was in danger of being flanked, and one of the company of the 128th PA attacked the farm. The 16th Mississippi allowed them to get very close and demanded that they surrender. The refusal cost the 128th Pennsylvania 12 casualties, including one officer that was killed. A second try produced no better results, and the 128th Pennsylvania stated that they would stay clear of the farm. This has been the William Bliss Farm Part 4. Now, General Winfield Scott Hancock's interest resulted in General Hayes talking to Colonel Thomas Smith about the situation. Colonel Smith, new to brigade command, was motivated to speak to Major John Hill of the 12th New Jersey. Companies B, H, E, and G volunteered for the attack, led by Captain Samuel Jobes. To impress the men with the importance of the attack, Colonel Smith accompanied them to the front. This attack hit the 16th Mississippi very hard, and they were unable to stop it. The 12th New Jersey, armed with smooth-bore muskets used in the .69 caliber buck and ball, with deadly effect at close range, but hardly any effect at long range. Taking the barn reduced the sniper fire, but the house managed a nailing fire at the Union line. General Hayes was getting frustrated by the new division's inability to control their front, and Colonel Smith was ordered to have the men in the barn take the house too. Captain A. Park Postles of the 1st Delaware, though ill, took the message to Captain Jobes in the barn. For this action, Captain Postles received the first Medal of Honor that would be awarded to the men in this fight. The 12th New Jersey attacked and took the house, In all, they had captured 7 officers and 85 men, while losing 38 of their own. The 1st Delaware would report 5 dead, 16 wounded, and 11 missing for the day. General Posey received word of this new development at 6 p.m. and was starting to coordinate a new attack on the farm. General James Longstreet's attack was working its way up the Union line, and Confederate forces in the area made a general advance. At the Bliss Farm, the 12th New Jersey was forced back toward their main line, or they would be surrounded. Posey was advancing on his front as Wright's brigade pushed almost to the crest of Cemetery Ridge. Posey's brigade, after hours of hard fighting, had stopped at the Bliss Farm when skirmishers 200 yards to the north, behind a worm fence, fired on his line. General Posey requested a new regiment to be sent to handle them, but was told that his orders would not allow, little by little, from the south to the north, unit by unit. The great Confederate attack of July 2nd was failing. Men in blue had diverted and slowed and finally broken the attack. The sun was going down, and with it the best chance of the Army of Northern Virginia had finding great victory on northern soil. This has been the William Bliss Farm Part 4. On both sides settled down on the night of July 2nd, 1864 on the battlefield. Weariness allowed some to sleep, amongst groans the cries of the wounded and dying. The only food was what each man carried, showing. Still, the normal pushing and shoving had to occur, even as night on the skirmish line. The Union had to try to push back, to maintain their line as far forward as possible. In the dark, men wandered into the wrong lines, were ambushed or sat quiet, waiting for the dawn. As the sun cleared Cemetery Ridge on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, the Bliss Farm was very apparent to both sides. On July 2nd, the skirmish lines had kept each other for a reasonable distance. Longstreet's attack had destroyed this balance, and Confederate skirmish line was much closer to Union lines than normal. Given the lack of a fire exercise, and that most men do not understand a bullet's trajectory, Civil War soldiers had a tendency to shoot high, shooting uphill. Aggravated this tendency. The Bliss Farm was almost level with the crest of Cemetery Ridge, and the 500-yard rear sight setting on the rifles made this a reasonable range. Fire directed at the crest was at worst likely to press near a target. Moreover, a miss would impact on the rear slope of the ridge among the artillery. This was totally unacceptable, and the final day of fighting for the Bliss Farm quickly started. Men in blue from Hayes, Gibbons, and Doubleday's divisions pushed against men in Butternut and Gray from the divisions of Anderson, Pender, and Rhodes. Descriptions of the fighting are varied, but some men reported hard fighting and others that both sides conducted a slow but steady fight. The after-action reports say that both sides were doing each other all the harm that they could, and most of the men on the line would agree. Corporal William Raymond of the 108th New York would win the Medal of Honor, approximately 1,000 to the skirmish line. While he was not wounded after the battle, he found 7 new buttonholes in his uniform. More and more, the Bliss Farm became dominant in the area. Described in many reports, it was listed as a citadel in itself, a paradise for sharpshooters, 75 feet long, 35 feet wide, and at least 40 feet high. The vertical upper story and wide windows at each end of the barn controlled the area. The frame house, which stood 200 feet to its north, provided an additional strong guard and supports of troops in the barn. To the men on Cemetery Ridge, taking the barn that damned the White House is a requirement. Hayes selects 5 companies of the 12th New Jersey to clear the barn. By using a knoll for cover, they reach the barn with few casualties. In a quick hard fight, they retake the barn simply by getting to the ground floor stable and climbing onto the main floor. This has been William Bliss Farm Part 6. Outside, the rebels are edging ever closer to the building and launching attacks. Packing orders to hold the barn at all costs in 12 New Jersey pulls back to the Union lines after losing 2 officers and over 20 enlisted men. Sniper fire from the farm was directed at Captain William A. Arnold's Battery A. 1st Rhode Island posted north of the copse of trees behind the inner stone wall. About 10 a.m., Captain Arnold was forced to seek help from Colonel Smith, suggesting to him that the barn, if not held, should be burned. General Hayes ordered Colonel Smith, the detail regiment, to retake and hold the barn. The 8 available companies of the 14th Connecticut, 2 companies being on the skirmish line, were given the task. Major Theodore G. Ellis commanded 4 companies that will act as a support of the element of Captain Samuel A. Moore, would attack the barn with 60 men. Captain Moore and the men moved quickly into the fields west of the Emmitsburg Road. Unlike the attack of the 12th New Jersey, no formation was attempted. When the order was given, each man attacked the barn as best he could. Running, dodging, the 60 men of the 12th New Jersey, raked by fire from the Bliss barn house and the long lane, retook the barn. Once again, the Mississippians give up the barn, taking positions in the house and orchard. Wishing to prevent a repeat of the last attack, Major Ellis decides that the house has to be taken too. The attack is subjected to enfilade fire from Long Lane, knocking down a number of men. After a bitter fight, the house is in Union hands. When the Confederate skirmish line drive into the orchard, the Corps responds with 30 men on the ridge, firing solid and case shot at the house and the barn. For the Federals, the house becomes a death trap. The walls are not proof against many balls, and much less has artillery rounds. Major Ellis reluctantly orders the men to abandon the house. Most run the gauntlet of the fire, taking position on the barn. Others, not willing to take the risk, find cover in the mountains or behind a large wood pile in the farmyard. For General Hayes, this is a very expensive and deadly game. Starting as an affair on the skirmish line, the Bliss Farm consumed his companies, then regiments, and now is requiring batteries of artillery. The Army of the Potomac's artillery is tightly controlled and cannot be ordered by fire, even by a division commander. On July 2nd, Meade has dispatched a staff officer to investigate why the battery was fired, and not waste the ammunition on non-essential targets. Even as the Confederate guns were firing on the farm, Major General Henry J. Hunt was issuing orders to his batteries to conserve ammunition for an expected attack, which we today would know as Pickett's Charge. Confederate Colonel Alexander E. Porter of Busby, placing the guns on the largest artillery bombardment of the war, he was upset to hear the 3rd Corps guns fire. Years after the battle, Alexander would write that this was a waste of ammunition that the Army could not afford. Starting with more better artillery ammunition was working to maintain that advantage. Every round would be held for use, which we would call Pickett's Charge. If the Bliss Farm could not be kept for the enemy, it would have to be destroyed. Orders were issued to destroy the barn and as many other of the buildings as possible. Sergeant Charles Hitchcock of the 111th New York volunteered to carry the order to the barn, taking his matches and paper too. Considering that Sergeant Hitchcock was on foot, Captain James Postles and Major Ellis and Company A ran to the house, which was used and not reoccupied, while the balance of the 14th Connecticut readied the barn for burning. The dead and wounded were removed from the buildings. Fires were set in the house, and the men retreated back into the barn. There, Major Ellis was asked if some of the men could take several of the live chickens back to their lines. Telling this story after the war, he stated permission on this occasion was granted. Shielded by the smoke from the house, with the fire of the barn taking hold, chickens squawking, the 14th Connecticut ran for safety to the Union line along the Emmitsburg Road. In minutes, the house and barn were engulfed in flames and shortly collapsed. About 11:15 on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, William Bliss's farm ceased to exist. This story is one that is not often talked about in the Battle of Gettysburg, the loss of a man's farm here, actually burned down by federal troops here to protect it. This farm again sat in no man's land, almost directly in the middle of Seminary and Cemetery Ridge, right here along the fields of Pickett's Charge. Yet, in the scale of the war, hardly gets any mentioned. I thought I'd do this video series here and bring the Battle of the William Bliss Farm back into life here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This has been the William Bliss Farm Part 8. Take a small tour here of the William Bliss Farm. In front of me is actually the site. This marker designates where the house stood at one time, and just behind it you can actually see the remnants of the basement stone foundation here in the high grass as it dips down. And the monument reads, "Center of the site of the Bliss House, captured and eventually burned by the 14th Connecticut Volunteers on July 3rd, 1863. The marker on the ground here, next to it, is for the Delaware Regiment, the 1st Regiment of Delaware Volunteers, who advanced skirmish line that we talked about reached the house here on July 2nd and 3rd of 1863. Of course, here in the distance here along Confederate Avenue on Seminary Ridge, directly in front of us is the North Carolina Monument, and just to its left, the Virginia Monument, the scene of Pickett's Charge right here. It's about 550 to 600 yards to Seminary Ridge, and over here is Cemetery Ridge. You can see the copse of trees at the high water mark and the angle here, the Pennsylvania Monument, and then of course the Nicholas Cordori barn roof over here. And that's about 500 to 600 yards in that direction. So again, the William Bliss Farm and house sat here in no man's land. This has been the William Bliss Farm Part 9 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Part 10 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And as we continue our tour of the William Bliss Farm site, this is the monument to the 12th Regiment of New Jersey Volunteers, also known as the Buck and Ball. And here on their attack on the barn, they dedicated this monument, and there's actually some photographs which I'll try to post of them here. This high grass area here that we're looking at is actually what is remaining, the only remaining thing from the barn. That's the bank that led to this huge barn that sat right here where this monument is here to the 14th Connecticut. This again was one of the largest barns south of the town of Gettysburg, and you can see the rebuilt Nicholas Cordori barn, which is pretty big. This one was much larger than that that sat here in July of 1863. This is a pretty amazing site. It's very rare that you ever see a visitor out here. The park has actually done a nice job in reconstructing the fence lines and rebuilding the orchards that once sat here. I do want to dedicate this video, which I will dedicate in my next part. But this William Bliss story has always fascinated me, and I thought I'd share it with everyone. This has been the William Bliss Farm, Part 10. Hi, this is Frank Book, and I'm here on the William Bliss Farm, shooting my William Bliss Farm video series. And I want to dedicate this video to a friend of mine who had recently passed away, Elwood Woody Christ, who really brought the Bliss Farm back into the annals of the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. It was his life to talk about. Of course, he wrote a book on the Bliss Farm, which is hard to find now, unfortunately, because it's out of print. But I've always been fascinated once I heard of the story of the Bliss Farm, because as people come to the Gettysburg National Military Park, see the sights and everywhere else. Even the monuments on the battlefield, like the 12th New Jersey and the 14th Connecticut, that sit over here at the high water mark. But they don't realize that just 400 or 500 yards away, directly in between Union and Confederate lines, site that was the William Bliss Farm, and that contains some more monuments that are rarely visited. Behind me was where William Bliss and Adeline and their 2 children lived here in July of 1863. They fled the battlefield on July 1st, 1863, leaving their house wide open, not realizing that the very next day Union and Confederate troops would clash in their farm in no man's land between both Union and Confederate lines. The farm would become so attacked on both sides and used by both sides that it would be a danger to both sides for it even to stand, and therefore it was decided by the Federal Army that the farm needed to be destroyed. After the war, claims were put in for the destruction of the William Bliss Farm, and unfortunately Bliss never received anything, as in so many claims. So this has a very sad history, but to think that today when you come to the Gettysburg National Military Park and you can walk along a field such as Pickett's Charge and never know that this farm even existed. And then on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, in the morning just before the attack of Pickett's Charge, there was this huge farm, a huge orchard, and this massive barn that stood here. And by 11 o'clock in the morning, just 2 or 3 hours before the bomb screens was saw, the farm was burned to the ground. Never received it. This has been our presentation of the William Bliss Farm here on the Gettysburg